1956, Pinewood Studios, London. The world's greatest stage actor and Hollywood's brightest star met on the same set. Laurence Olivier, the master of Shakespeare, refused to call Marilyn Monroe darling, not just in character, but in real life too. During the filming of The Prince and the Showgirl, the same scene repeated every day. Olivier exploding in anger, Monroe running to her dressing room in tears, the production crew losing hours. But the real loss was something else entirely. Olivier saw Monroe as a dumb blonde. Monroe was trying to prove herself as a serious actress. This wasn't just a film shoot, this was one of Hollywood's greatest battles, talent or appearance, respect or fame, and the battlefield was a British film set. When Marilyn died in 1962, Olivier barely spoke about her, but in 1982, when he wrote his memoirs, he confessed something that would change everything we thought we knew about those 18 days in London. Before we dive deeper into this untold story, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths behind Hollywood's golden age, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you the stories that shaped cinema history, one revelation at a time. The year 1956 marked a turning point in Hollywood history. The studio system that had controlled every aspect of an actor's career for decades was beginning to crack. Stars were demanding more money, more creative control, more respect. Marilyn Monroe was at the forefront of this revolution, though few recognized it at the time. She had just formed Marilyn Monroe Productions with photographer Milton Green, a bold move that shocked the industry. She was the first major female star to start her own production company since Mary Pickford in the silent era. The establishment saw this as rebellion. They wanted their compliant blonde bombshell back. What they got instead was a woman studying Stanislavski's method at the Actors Studio in New York, determined to be taken seriously as an artist. Laurence Olivier, meanwhile, stood as the embodiment of theatrical prestige. He had conquered Shakespeare on stage and screen, earning international acclaim. He represented everything Monroe aspired to: respect, artistic credibility, recognition as a serious performer. When he agreed to direct and star opposite her in The Prince and the Showgirl, it seemed like the perfect partnership, a British knight of the theater and an American movie goddess. The press called it a meeting of titans, but what happened behind closed doors would become one of the most documented disasters in film history. The clash wasn't just about two different acting styles or two oversized egos. It was about class, culture, gender, and the fundamental question of what makes someone a real actor. Olivier had trained at the finest theatrical institutions in Britain. Monroe had studied her craft in acting classes while working as a model. Olivier worked from the outside in, building characters through voice, movement, and technical precision. Monroe worked from the inside out, drawing on emotional memory and personal experience. These weren't just different approaches, they were opposing philosophies of art itself. From the first day of rehearsals at Pinewood Studios, tension permeated the set. Olivier had planned a traditional British film production, precise, scheduled, efficient. Monroe arrived late, often by hours. She brought her acting coach, Paula Strasberg, wife of Lee Strasberg from the Actors Studio. Olivier saw this as an insult to his authority. Who was this American woman to question his direction? But Monroe trusted Strasberg's method training more than Olivier's classical technique. After each take, Monroe would look not at Olivier but at Strasberg for approval. Olivier's face would darken, his jaw would clench. The crew would hold their breath, waiting for the explosion. It always came. "Don't you trust me?" Olivier would demand. Monroe would shrink back, her eyes filling with tears, and retreat to her dressing room. Hours would pass, production would halt, the budget would balloon, and the British press, initially charmed by Monroe's arrival in London, began to turn against her. They called her unprofessional, difficult, spoiled. They championed Olivier as the suffering artist, trying to work with an impossible American diva. But what the press didn't report, what Olivier himself would only admit decades later, was what happened during those long waits in Monroe's dressing room. Paula Strasberg wasn't just offering comfort or stroking Monroe's ego, she was working with her, helping her find the emotional truth of each scene using method techniques. Monroe would emerge from those sessions and deliver performances that even Olivier had to admit were extraordinary. The problem was the process. Olivier wanted efficiency. Monroe needed time. Olivier worked from intellect. Monroe worked from emotion. and neither could understand or respect the other's approach. The film's cinematographer Jack Cardiff later recalled watching Monroe and Olivier in a particularly difficult scene. Olivier delivered his lines with perfect diction, flawless timing, and theatrical grandeur. Monroe responded with something Cardiff described as pure magic, a vulnerability and authenticity that couldn't be taught. When Cardiff reviewed the rushes that evening, he was stunned. On screen, Monroe completely overshadowed Olivier. Her naturalistic style made his theatrical approach look artificial, outdated. Cardiff mentioned this to Olivier. The director's response was telling, "I know, that's what infuriates me." To understand the conflict between Monroe and Olivier, we must understand the seismic shift happening in acting during the 1950s. For centuries, acting had been considered a craft of external transformation. Actors learned to control their voice, their body, their facial expressions. They studied how to project to the back of a theater, how to hit their marks, how to deliver lines with perfect clarity. This was Olivier's training. This was the British theatrical tradition. Then came Konstantin Stanislavski, the Russian theater practitioner whose ideas would revolutionize acting in America. Stanislavski argued that actors should draw on their own emotions, their own memories, their own psychological truth to create authentic performances. Lee Strasberg adapted Stanislavski's system into what became known as the method at the Actors Studio in New York. Actors were taught to access real emotion through emotional memory, recalling moments from their own lives that connected to their characters' experiences. This produced performances of stunning realism and psychological depth, but it also required time, vulnerability, and a safe environment to explore painful personal experiences. Marilyn Monroe embraced the method with desperate intensity. She saw it as her path to legitimacy, to respect, to artistic credibility. She attended classes at the Actors Studio, studied with Lee Strasberg privately, and brought Paula Strasberg onto her film sets as her personal coach. When Monroe was late to set, she wasn't being capricious or difficult. She was preparing emotionally, accessing the psychological state her character required. When she couldn't remember her lines, it wasn't because she was stupid or unprofessional. It was because she was so deeply immersed in emotional truth that the specific words became secondary to the feeling. Olivier saw none of this. To him, Monroe's process looked like chaos, unprofessionalism, and self-indulgence. Why couldn't she just learn her lines, hit her marks, and deliver the performance? That's what professional actors did. He had no framework to understand or value what Monroe was attempting. And Monroe, already insecure about her lack of formal training, interpreted Olivier's criticism as confirmation of her worst fears, that she would never be good enough, never be respected, never be seen as a real actress. But the conflict wasn't just about acting technique. It was about class, nationality, and gender. Olivier came from British aristocratic theater tradition. Monroe came from poverty, orphanages, and foster homes in Los Angeles. Olivier had attended the Central School of Speech and Drama. Monroe had educated herself, reading voraciously, but always conscious of her lack of formal education. Olivier spoke with the refined accent of the British upper class. Monroe spoke with a breathy, childlike voice that had become her trademark, but that she herself hated. These differences created a chasm that neither could bridge. Olivier's biographer later wrote that Olivier simply couldn't take Monroe seriously as an artist because of her background, her image, and yes, her gender. In Olivier's world, serious actors were trained in classical theater. They performed Shakespeare. They had technique, discipline, control. Monroe had none of these credentials. She was a movie star, which in Olivier's hierarchy was several rungs below a stage actor. And she was a woman whose fame rested on her sexuality, which in 1956 meant she couldn't possibly be intelligent or talented in any meaningful way. Monroe felt this condescension in every interaction. Colin Clark, a young assistant on the film who later wrote about his experiences, described Monroe confiding in him, "Larry thinks I'm a fool. He treats me like I'm stupid." Clark observed that Olivier's direction to Monroe was often patronizing, simplified as if speaking to a child. Meanwhile, Olivier would engage in complex discussions about character motivation and subtext with the other British actors on set. The message was clear. They were real actors. Monroe was just a movie star playing at being an actress. This wounded Monroe deeply because it confirmed everything she feared about herself. Despite her success, despite her fame, despite the fact that she was one of the most recognizable faces on Earth, she still felt like Norma Jean, the unwanted little girl that nobody took seriously. The British press's coverage of the production only reinforced this dynamic. They portrayed Olivier as the suffering genius, trying to extract a performance from a difficult, temperamental American blonde. Monroe as the problem. Olivier as the solution. Talent versus beauty. Art versus commerce. Respect versus sex appeal. When The Prince and the Showgirl was released in 1957, critics and audiences noticed something that the troubled production had obscured. Monroe's performance was remarkable. She was luminous, funny, touching, and completely natural on screen. Olivier's performance, while technically proficient, felt stiff and theatrical by comparison. Monroe had understood something that Olivier hadn't, that film acting and stage acting are fundamentally different. On stage, performances must be larger, more projected, more externally expressive to reach an audience hundreds of feet away. On film, the camera captures every subtle shift in the eyes, every tiny change in expression. Film rewards intimacy, naturalism, the internal life of a character. Monroe's method training, with its emphasis on authentic emotion and psychological truth, was perfectly suited to film. Olivier's theatrical technique, with its emphasis on vocal and physical control, looked artificial on screen. This is what Jack Cardiff had seen in those rushes. This is what Olivier had found so frustrating. Monroe had mastered a form of acting that he, for all his theatrical genius, had not yet fully grasped. Decades later, when Olivier wrote his autobiography Confessions of an Actor in 1982, he finally admitted what he had been unable to acknowledge in 1956. "I was simply beastly to Marilyn. She was trying so hard, and I was impatient and unkind." He described watching the finished film and realizing that Monroe had given the better performance. He confessed that his jealousy and insecurity had driven his cruelty toward her, and he expressed regret that he had never apologized to her during her lifetime. By the time Olivier understood what Monroe had been attempting, she had been dead for 20 years. The vindication came too late, but it came, and it revealed something important. Monroe had been right. Her instincts had been correct. Her approach had been valid. She just hadn't had the confidence or the support to trust herself in the face of Olivier's opposition. 3 years later, Monroe found herself on another set with another acclaimed director, but this time, the dynamic was entirely different. Billy Wilder, the Viennese-American director known for classics like Double Indemnity and Sunset Boulevard, cast Monroe in what would become one of the greatest comedies in cinema history, Some Like It Hot. Wilder was an altogether different personality from Olivier. He was pragmatic, not precious. He valued results over process, and most importantly, he understood comedy in a way that Olivier never had. Wilder knew that Monroe possessed something rare and valuable, comic timing that couldn't be taught. He had seen it in her earlier films like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and The 7-Year Itch. He understood that beneath the sex symbol image was a gifted comedic actress. But Wilder also knew about Monroe's difficulties. By 1958, when Some Like It Hot began production, Monroe's problems had intensified. Her marriage to playwright Arthur Miller was crumbling. Her dependency on pills, barbiturates to sleep, amphetamines to wake had worsened. Her chronic lateness had become legendary in Hollywood. Studios considered her uninsurable. Directors refused to work with her. Her reputation as difficult threatened to end her career. Wilder decided to work with Monroe anyway. He wanted her specific qualities on screen, but he approached the challenge with eyes open. He scheduled her scenes for afternoon shoots when she was more likely to arrive. He built extra time into the production schedule to accommodate delays. He kept a doctor on set to help manage her prescription drug use. And most importantly, he treated her with patience and respect, even when she tested that patience to its limits. The famous story of Monroe forgetting her lines in Some Like It Hot has been told many times, but it's worth revisiting. In one scene, Monroe had to walk into a room, open some drawers looking for bourbon, and say the line, "It's me, sugar." Simple enough. But Monroe couldn't remember it. Take after take, she would say, "Where's the bourbon?" or "It's sugar," or she would forget the line entirely. After dozens of takes, Wilder had the line written on pieces of paper and placed inside the drawers Monroe was opening. She would open a drawer, see the line, say it, and close the drawer. Problem solved. Monroe completed the take. The crew applauded, and Wilder moved on. Years later, Wilder famously said, "I have discussed this with my doctor and my psychiatrist, and they tell me I'm too old and too rich to go through this again." He also said, "She was an absolute nightmare to work with, but when you saw the rushes, you knew it was worth it." This was the essential difference between Wilder and Olivier. Olivier saw Monroe's process as a failure of professionalism. Wilder saw it as the necessary cost of genius. Olivier wanted Monroe to change her approach to match his. Wilder adapted his approach to accommodate hers. Olivier judged Monroe by theatrical standards of discipline and technique. Wilder judged her by the only standard that mattered in cinema, what appeared on screen, and what appeared on screen in Some Like It Hot was extraordinary. Monroe's performance as Sugar Cane is a masterclass in comedy. Her timing is impeccable, her line delivery is perfect, her physical comedy is brilliant, and beneath all the laughs, there's a touching vulnerability that makes Sugar a real, sympathetic character, rather than just a comic prop. Film critics and scholars now consider Monroe's performance in Some Like It Hot to be one of the greatest in comedy cinema. Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon, her co-stars, both outstanding actors in their own right, both said that Monroe stole the film. "She was magic," Lemmon recalled. "Yes, she made us wait. Yes, she drove us crazy. But when the camera rolled, she gave us something no one else could." Curtis, who famously complained about kissing Monroe being like kissing Hitler, later admitted he had been cruel and unfair. He said Monroe was struggling with demons that none of them understood at the time. He wished he had been kinder. The pattern repeats: initial frustration, later respect, eventual regret. Some Like It Hot was released in 1959 to massive critical and commercial success. It remains one of the most beloved comedies ever made. The American Film Institute ranks it as the greatest American comedy of all time, and Marilyn Monroe's performance is a central reason why. Wilder gave her the framework she needed to succeed, and she delivered. If Olivier represented opposition and Wilder represented pragmatic accommodation, then George Cukor represented something else: genuine understanding and advocacy. Cukor, one of Hollywood's most respected directors, was known as a woman's director, a term that could be patronizing, but in Cukor's case reflected his genuine ability to draw nuanced, powerful performances from actresses. He had directed Katharine Hepburn, Judy Garland, Ingrid Bergman, and Greta Garbo to some of their finest work. When Cukor was hired to direct Monroe in what would be her final unfinished film, Something's Gotta Give, in 1962, he approached her with compassion and respect. By this time, Monroe's personal crisis had reached its peak. Her marriage to Arthur Miller had ended in divorce. Her dependency on barbiturates and alcohol had become severe. Her chronic illnesses, anxiety, and depression made working nearly impossible. The studio, 20th Century Fox, was losing patience. They needed Monroe to complete the film. The budget was spiraling, production was halting, pressure was mounting. Cukor understood that Monroe wasn't being difficult by choice. He recognized that she was suffering, that she was ill, that she needed help, not punishment. He defended her to the studio. He restructured shooting schedules to work around her limitations. He created a safe, supportive environment on set. "Marilyn isn't temperamental," Cukor said. "She's terrified." Cukor saw what Olivier had missed, that Monroe's difficulties stemmed not from unprofessionalism, but from crippling anxiety and insecurity. Her lateness wasn't disrespect, it was paralysis. Her memory problems weren't stupidity, they were the effects of medication and emotional distress. Her need for multiple takes wasn't perfectionism, it was a desperate attempt to overcome her fear of failure. Cukor directed Monroe with tenderness. He would spend hours talking with her, building her confidence, helping her feel safe enough to perform. When she arrived on set, often hours late, he wouldn't scold her. He would welcome her warmly and gently guide her through the work. The footage that was shot during those troubled weeks shows Monroe looking more beautiful than she had in years. There's a swimming pool scene that became iconic. Monroe swimming nude in a pool, emerging from the water like Venus. It's both erotic and innocent, playful and vulnerable, classic Marilyn. But it would be one of the last scenes she ever filmed. In June 1962, 20th Century Fox made a decision. They fired Marilyn Monroe from Something's Got to Give. They blamed her for the production delays and budget overruns. They threatened to sue her for breach of contract, and they announced they were recasting her role with Lee Remick. The studio's decision was brutal and public. Monroe was humiliated. Her career appeared to be over. No studio would hire an actress who had been fired mid-production. The press, which had turned against Monroe in recent years, published gleeful stories about her downfall. Hollywood insiders whispered that she was finished. George Cukor was furious with the studio's decision. He believed Monroe could complete the film if given proper support. He argued that the footage they had shot proved she was still capable of brilliant work. He offered to resign in protest. But Fox wouldn't budge. The decision had been made. Monroe was out. Cukor was devastated. He had grown genuinely fond of Monroe during their time working together. He recognized her talent, her vulnerability, her desperate desire to be valued as more than just a body. He knew she was struggling, and he feared what the firing would do to her already fragile mental state. His fears were well-founded. 2 months later, on August 5, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her home in Brentwood, California. The official cause of death was listed as probable suicide from an overdose of barbiturates. She was 36 years old. George Cukor was among the Hollywood figures most affected by Monroe's death. He never completed Something's Got to Give. The footage that existed was eventually released as a documentary, showing what might have been. Cukor spoke about Monroe with sadness and affection for the rest of his life. He never blamed her for the production's troubles. He blamed the studio system that had failed her, the industry that had exploited her, and the society that had reduced her to a sex object while denying her the respect she craved. Marilyn was a victim, Cukor said, but not in the way people think. She was a victim of her own success. Her image became a prison she couldn't escape. When we examine Marilyn Monroe through the eyes of Laurence Olivier, Billy Wilder, and George Cukor, we see 3 different relationships, 3 different dynamics, 3 different outcomes, but we also see a consistent pattern. Each director, in his own way, had to confront the gap between Monroe's image and her reality. The world saw a sex symbol, a blonde bombshell, a walking male fantasy. The directors saw something more complex, a talented actress struggling with insecurity, an intelligent woman fighting for respect, a damaged person seeking validation. Olivier, to his later shame, couldn't see past the stereotype. His prejudices about class, nationality, and gender prevented him from recognizing Monroe's gifts until it was too late. His theatrical training made him value technique over authenticity, control over vulnerability. He wanted Monroe to be something she wasn't and couldn't appreciate what she was. The result was mutual misery and a working relationship that hurt them both. Billy Wilder saw Monroe more clearly. He recognized her talent even while finding her behavior exasperating. He understood that great art sometimes comes from messy, difficult processes. He was willing to accommodate Monroe's needs because he valued the results she delivered. His approach was pragmatic rather than ideological. He didn't need Monroe to work his way, he just needed her to work. And she did, brilliantly. George Cukor went further. He saw not just Monroe's talent but her pain. He recognized that her difficulties weren't character flaws, but symptoms of genuine suffering. He treated her with compassion and advocated for her even when it was professionally risky. His kindness couldn't save Monroe's life, but it gave her some moments of safety and dignity in her final months. These 3 relationships tell us something important about Monroe and about Hollywood. Monroe wasn't the problem. The industry's inability to see her as a whole person was the problem. The studio system that exploited her sexuality while denying her artistic ambitions was the problem. The culture that valued beauty over intelligence, image over substance, was the problem. Looking back now, with decades of perspective, film historians and acting teachers have reached a consensus. Marilyn Monroe was ahead of her time. Her intuitive understanding of film acting, her emotional accessibility, her naturalistic style, these were the future of screen performance. Marlon Brando, who studied at the Actors Studio with Monroe, would become the most celebrated actor of his generation, using the same method. Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, Meryl Streep, all the great film actors of subsequent decades would use approaches much closer to Monroe's than to Olivier's. Olivier himself eventually acknowledged this. In his later years, he softened his approach, incorporating more naturalistic elements into his film performances. He came to understand what Monroe had known instinctively: the camera is intimate, it sees everything. Theatrical projection reads as artifice on film, internal truth reads as power. Monroe understood the medium. Olivier, for all his genius on stage, was still learning it during The Prince and the Showgirl. The student was, in that context, more advanced than the teacher. But she lacked the confidence and the institutional support to trust her own knowledge. Marilyn Monroe died believing she had failed. She died thinking the world saw her as nothing more than a dumb blonde. She died without knowing that future generations would recognize her as a gifted actress whose instincts were correct, whose approach was valid, whose struggles were heroic. The directors who worked with her, some understanding, some not, have all contributed to our evolving understanding of who Monroe really was. Olivier's initial cruelty and later remorse teach us about prejudice and growth. Wilder's exasperated appreciation teaches us about valuing results over process. Kafka's compassionate advocacy teaches us about seeing the person behind the image. Together, these three relationships paint a portrait of an artist trying desperately to be taken seriously in an industry that wanted to keep her as a commodity. They show us a woman of intelligence and talent struggling against a system designed to reduce her to her physical appearance. They reveal the human cost of fame, the prison of iconic status, the tragedy of dying before vindication comes. When we look at the surviving footage of Monroe's work in The Prince and the Showgirl, in Some Like It Hot, in the fragments of Something's Gotta Give, we see something undeniable. We see a performer of extraordinary ability. We see comedic timing that can't be taught. We see vulnerability that breaks your heart. We see intelligence, craft, and commitment. And we're left with a haunting question. What else could Marilyn Monroe have achieved if the directors, the studios, and the culture had supported her instead of fighting her? If Olivier had been kind in 1956, if Fox had been patient in 1962, if someone, anyone, had helped her before August 5, we'll never know. But we do know this: the directors who took the time to look beyond the blonde hair and the famous figure saw someone remarkable. They saw an actress. They saw an artist. They saw Marilyn, not Monroe, Marilyn. And that's who she had always wanted to be seen as, just herself. Finally respected, finally taken seriously, finally enough. She died before that happened. But her performances remain, and they prove she was right all along. She was a real actress. She was talented. She was enough. She was always enough. The world just took too long to see it.